All right, guys, so we're picking up with basically the stages of collective bargaining. So first is preparation. Both sides, management and the union, would decide on what their objectives are and what they're hoping to get out of this bargaining session, what they want to have end up in the collective bargaining agreement. And try to anticipate what the other side's going to ask for. Then we'll set some timelines and negotiations and set some ground rules. We'll have proposals from both sides, discussions, meetings, and then the contract will be written up and voted on by the union members. Once we have a collective bargaining agreement, that is basically what we live by, what the employees agree to do, what management agrees to do for the duration of the contract. And then once the contract expires or is going to expire, we would bargain all over again. But we can't always come to an agreement. And so what we have next is bargaining impasse. Bargaining impasse can result in several outcomes. So impasse means we can't come to a solution. We can't agree on what we need to do. So there could be an economic strike, which is where there would be disputes over wages and benefits, an unfair labor practices strike, which would protest basically an illegal activity by the employer, something that is unfair. Wildcat strikes are unauthorized strikes. So when employees decide to go on strike and the union has basically told them not to, those are no longer legal. Sympathy strikes also have been outlawed. So that's when one group of union members decides to go on strike, not because of their own grievances, but because of support for another union group that is on strike. It's important to know the difference between economic strikes and unfair labor practices strikes and wildcat and sympathy strikes because they're not all the same. Wildcat and sympathy strikes, of course, are illegal. Economic strikes and unfair labor practice strikes are legal, but they also have their own differences. When you are on strike, the company does not have to pay you. They can hire temporary workers to replace you. Now, whether you are guaranteed to get your job back after the strike is over depends on the type of strike that it is. So economic strikers who are striking because we can't get to an agreement on, the collective bargaining agreement. We can't agree on wages or something like that. They can be permanently replaced. So if I've hired a replacement for you, we end the strike, you want to come back to work, and I've hired a replacement, I do not have to fire that replacement and rehire you. Now, what I do have to do is if another position opens up that you're qualified for, I have to offer that position to you if you haven't found another job somewhere else. But I don't have to fire anyone that I replaced you with. So you are not necessarily guaranteed to get your job back. On the other hand, someone who's striking under unfair labor practices, employers can hire temporary replacement workers, but when the strike is over, the striking workers have to be given their jobs back. So those temporary workers would be fired in exchange for reinstating people who were striking because of unfair labor practices. Okay, now you lose your protection if you do anything unlawful that is considered unlawful under the National Labor Relations Act or the Wagner Act. So strikes that endanger the employer's property, for example, and some other outlawed practices. If you strike under those conditions, you have no guarantees. No matter what kind of strike it is, you lose all of your rights, basically. Now, there can be some state laws about strikes as well, so you have to be aware of that in the jurisdiction that you're under. But nationally, that's the difference. Economic strike, you're not necessarily getting your job back afterwards. Unfair labor practices strike, you will get your job back as long as you don't do anything illegal during the strike. A lockout is basically the opposite of the strike. So instead of the workers deciding not to work until an agreement is reached, lockout can lock employees out of the factory or office building or whatever it is. Instead of going on strike, workers can decide to do a work slowdown where they just basically take longer to get their job done. Or they can have a sick out or a walkout. Basically, all of the employees call in sick. That's another negotiating tactic to try to make managers cave to what you want them to do for you. Okay, and this is again just kind of the recap of the chapter. You can see here the differences between economic strike, unfair labor practices strike, sick out, things like that. The last thing in this chapter is the grievance process. So once we've agreed on a collective bargaining agreement, that is basically our contract for the period that it is in place. Employees will behave according to the agreement. The company will behave according to the agreement. Now, if employees feel like the contract has been violated, then they can start a grievance. And you have some examples here of why you might file a grievance. And then there are different types of grievances. One that applies to like a single person, for example, versus a group, things like that. And then this is basically how the grievance process tends to work. You discuss the grievance with your manager. Maybe you have a union rep with you. The grievance is, if you can't get it resolved, you would express the grievance in writing. HR management and the union would discuss and then express a decision back in writing. The union will decide whether to accept that decision or escalate the grievance, in which case it could be brought to the national body of the union. And then a mediator or an arbitrator may be brought in to come to a final decision. Arbitrators' decisions are binding. So that's a third party who comes in to look at both sides and make a decision. Whatever they decide is what goes. You can't go back on it once arbitration has happened. Okay, and then you see here. Note that it also says mediation on this step rather than arbitration. If you bring in a mediator, again, that's a third party who's supposed to look objectively at both sides, but a mediator's decision is non-binding. So it is not as strict as arbitration. Once the arbitrator makes a decision, that's the decision. There's no going back. Once the mediator suggests a decision, you could still decide, well, we're not going along with that. So that's kind of the difference between mediation and arbitration.